Whoever's listening to this podcast right now, if you're working in a game studio, you know of something. You're just not going to bring it up. There's a problem and you have not raised it. Round up all the people on a team and you ask them to attribute credit for the game, you'd wind up with like 10,000%, right? What if you could just be happy and have everything you wanted for your entire life and then you die? I would not want that. To me, that was maybe one of the biggest mistakes. And if I were to find someone like that, but just say, you know what, we're going to pay whatever it takes, it probably would have been worth it. Like, how would you define success for yourself?
How has and will international development disrupt the games industry? Why would someone choose to go overseas to make great games? What role is India specifically going to play in the future of game dev? Gaming is a huge industry, and as more and more time passes, different parts of the world join the quest to make amazing and profitable games. Huge hits don't always come from Europe and North America. Joseph Kim is no stranger to international dev. He currently runs a studio, Lila Games, that is based out of India, and he's here to talk about the international scene, why he went with India as the place to base his company, and what advice he'd give to leaders in game dev in an increasingly global industry. Joseph, how are you doing?
Doing all right. Thanks for having me, Ben.
So why don't you just start with a little bit about who you are, and we'll go from there.
I've had a bit of a varied career. So I started off in software development, then went into management consulting, then went into game development. That all led me to want to try to start my own company, which leads me to the current opportunity that I have today, which is Lila Games, and try to build a studio out of India.
Awesome. Love it. Okay, I kind of want to start with a question about game dev. So when you look at game dev today, what do you see?
So what I see is basically a lot of problems. And this is when I started the company 4 years ago. But what I saw were increasing trends that were troubling to me. And those, and I don't want to like piss anyone off. This is just my personal opinion. But what I thought was a level of complacency, especially by Western game developers, where there wasn't enough, care. There wasn't enough passion, drive. And one of the things I found working at FunPlus, because we had a lot of game studios there at the time, is that we were the King of Avalon team was the only hardcore team at FunPlus at that time. Every other team failed. And maybe there's a better way, but what I found is that for new game development, effort and hardcore work culture makes a difference. I'm sure there's a lot of other things that make a difference, but when I was working in publishing, I just felt more and more uncomfortable with the fact that there seemed to be this level of complacency in the West. And I just didn't think that with the increasing costs, this kind of feeling of complacency, that we could be competitive. And so I thought China was going to come kick our ass. And 4 years later, it's kind of been playing out. And so what I felt was that, and we can go into more specifics in terms of India itself now or later, but I just felt like I didn't think that the model of working with some of the world's most expensive developers out of California, as well as having that level of complacency with some of the folks that I knew, and I don't want to have any hate. I don't want to I'm not no commentary or no specific, I don't want to say anything negative about these guys. I think it's a choice, but I just didn't think I could find a team that could do well from a new game development perspective in terms of some of the, if I were to start a company, I just didn't think I could find that team that was hardcore. And, so just thinking about the work ethic, just thinking about the costs, I just didn't think we could be successful out of California or the West.
Yeah. You said you saw several trends. You mentioned complacency being one of them. That even a few years ago, and you said you've seen that continue to play out. That there wasn't that I don't know, that drive, or that, like, we really need to get this done. Let's get this done, and let's recognize that, yeah, this might be a lot of work. This might be more work. 40 hours a week may not always be enough
Right.
to get all the work done we need to get done so that we can ship this game. But we're making a new game here. One of the things we need to put out is a lot of effort. What other trends did you see, and have they continued till today?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the other thing that bothered me a little bit was, and I'll just mention a few things, but one was just a lack of attention to detail. And I would
Okay.
say, and I've kind of, joked, although I'm a little bit serious about MBAs that go into game development, but there's too much
Mm,
like high level thinking, kind of like what I call cloud level thinking versus on the ground operational thinking. And there's just
mm-hmm.
often too much hand waving around what to do in a game. And it's almost like you need more people to row the boat than to direct the rowers from the direction to go. And
Yeah.
I just felt like there was this disconnect between the high level strategy and thinking about what to do, and a lot of like, very charismatic, smart talkers versus people who actually went into the details, played the games, understood insights about games and what kind of games should be developed, not from hand waving and just kind of looking at deconstructions that some other person wrote and just, trying to sound smart, but actually getting into the weeds of the games and really understanding from, as Elon Musk would say, first principles about what makes a good game and what kind of game to develop. So there was that. And then also, and this was a mistake I think we made at FunPlus as well, but we had a very kind of monolithic game development model where I just felt
Mm,
like the way that we were developing the game did not allow for things. These are things that we've talked about before, Ben, in terms of like having proper pre-production, keeping
yeah.
teams as small as possible, trying to be more agile in terms of development, and then how you do game validation. Now, I think so. King of Avalon was a success, but to some degree, I felt like it was because we had one insight, which was to try and make the game a little bit more casual and to like open up the funnel for players. But to some degree, we just got lucky. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that if we were going for a more dynamic game genre or a new game genre, which would require more pivots and basically trying to adjust game design more frequently and more dynamically, we probably would not have been successful.
Mm. There's. I was having a conversation recently about the idea of this luck, and I think it's. I think one, it's not helpful to just go like, well, I was lucky or unlucky with all the decisions you make in life. You have to at some point take agency. Simultaneously, the reality is the circumstances outside your control play a role. And one of the things I've seen in Western dev is almost this pedigreed approach to, and then perhaps this is similar to the MBA thing you were describing, of, oh, if I can find someone who's made a successful game in the past, well, they must know how to repeat that success. And multiple major studios have taken this approach that I'm aware of. And we've put together, like, let's find all the best people in all the different disciplines and we'll put them together on a team and they'll make a great game because we have all the best people, right? Because that's how you make a great game. And I think basically 100% of those efforts have
Well,
failed.
I think there's another nuance to that game too, because if you round up all the people on a team that have worked on a successful game and you ask them to attribute who was responsible or, credit for the game, you'd wind up with like 10,000%, right? Like,
Yes, yep.
because one, you've got, and oftentimes and especially for some of these bigger games, you've got so many people that work on different aspects of the game, so you don't really quite know who was responsible for what. But I do think like, and let me be clear, I do think leadership does matter, and I do think
Oh, yeah.
if you find the right leads, and this kind of like kind of Teamboat 6 from Extreme Ownership by Jocko Willing. So that leader
Oh yeah, yeah,
matters.
yeah,
But
yeah,
I do think sometimes it's difficult to really understand who was really responsible for moving the needle or the success of a game. So that's the other aspect of the other issue, which you're talking about when you find some game teams that try to recruit folks from previously successful games, not only not being able to repeat a success, but also finding the right person for a specific area or scope of work
yeah,
that you're looking for.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Let me see. Okay, so there's a couple. So we've talked about complacency. We've talked about to some extent personnel. What else? What else is out there? And what do you see like? What do you see being the big determiners of where the industry sits today? As it's in a, at least in the West, it feels like it's in a very unstable, disrupted state.
Yeah, I mean, I think like, well, I would say there are a few characteristics that I believe are that have, in my experience, kind of are correlated with better outcomes. And
Mm-hmm.
so, one is, as I mentioned, a hardcore work ethic. I think for me, that's been the number one thing. I think that even if the strategy may not be optimal in terms of like the specific game design and things of that nature, if you have a team that works really hard and really cares a lot, then I think those are the teams that kind of figure it out, that can work through all the hundreds and thousands of small decisions that need to be made right and can work through those problems. I also think that stakes matters. And so when you think about why is it that smaller teams can outperform really big teams,
Mm-hmm.
I think that from, from my perspective, I believe that that happens oftentimes because there are oftentimes many big problems in game studios that actually people are aware of. And it's kind of like the elephant in the room that nobody talks about, but everybody knows what
Yeah.
that problem is or who the specific problem person is,
Mm.
but nothing is done about it. And if you're working a 9 to 5 job and you just want to make your salary and go home to your wife and kids and, or you with your family or whatever, you're not going to make a big deal about it because, and if you do, sometimes you're going to be punished for it, depending on the culture of the company that you're at. So,
Yeah.
but if the stakes are really high enough so that it's like, okay, I care about this so much because I've sacrificed so much. I've given up so much. So much of my life depends on the success of this, which is more often the case in a smaller startup versus a large company. Then you're going to bring up
Yeah.
those problems. And I can
Yeah.
say, for the first, I've been at this for four years. It's only recently that I'm barely breaking even, but for 5 years, because, even before then I wasn't making money. I've been losing money every month. And so when I look at that, my bank balance going down every month, and I think about the sacrifice that I've made because of the massive amount of time that I've invested. And for the first 4 years, I took like 3 days of vacation total, and that includes
Mm.
weekends. And if I take a Saturday
Mm.
off, I would call that a holiday for me. And I think about the money that I've lost and the time I spend away from family, then you better believe I'm going to bring up an issue with a co-founder or with an employee or whoever. That
Yeah.
doesn't happen in a big company. And in fact, working at some big companies, I've been told sometimes, leave that alone. Hey, here's this huge problem we have right here. It's like, whoa, 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 whoa. Don't talk about that. Leave it alone. And so when
Yeah.
you have an environment like that, you have this big problem that is going to remain there and not get addressed. But in a
Yeah.
company with stakes, you're going to address those problems because you have to. So hardcore work ethic, stakes, I think also just experience, right? Because for a lot of new game teams, and we've made a lot of mistakes over the past 4 years, but we've been slowly improving and we've been slowly figuring things out for our specific situation, for the kind of employees that we have. And generally, I think that number is about 4 years. And so the teams that have been working together for 4 years together, generally you see better outcomes just because they've worked through a lot of
Mm.
the problems in the past. And there's a little bit of
And
survivorship bias there as well. But those are the teams
yeah.
that often have fewer problems because they generally work them.
And when you say experience there, you're not describing, oh, this is somebody who's got 10 years of experience in the industry doing this thing. It's
Oh,
actually
working
this group
together.
of people,
This group of people that have worked
working
together for
together. Yeah.
4 years.
Yeah.
And in fact, when you look at some of these teams, for example, some of these very successful Chinese teams, like, Lilith's a good example. They worked together at Tencent for 4 years together, then they left, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you see a bunch of examples like that, and time again, I would say if you find a team, hardcore work ethic, big stakes, have worked together for 4 years. And then also I would say, generally speaking, and this is not always the case, but generally speaking, if they have a specific focus, like, these guys are incredible at match three, like Peak Games, for example, right? Or sorry, Dream Games came from Peak, right? They had a
Yeah.
lot
Okay.
of experience in a single genre. They know that genre extremely well. So they're very familiar with the very small nuances in a game, because one of the things that
Yeah.
if you worked in game development that is that sometimes it's a very, very small thing that can make the difference between success or failure. Like one
Yeah.
feature, one small thing can literally double your D7 retention.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. All right. Let's move on to the meat of this around why India. So why build a studio in India based on everything you've
Yeah,
said?
sure. So I think one other factor I should probably talk to you about is, as an old guy in the games industry and as someone who's kind of having like a midlife crisis, I would say that, I read this essay by Clayton Christensen called How Will You Measure Your Life? This exercise of when you think about at the end of your life, looking back and thinking about, was it worth it? Like, how would you define success for yourself? And
Mm.
I did have offers for executive roles in which I could have just done the same thing, work 9 to 5, make good money, have a lot of time to
Mm-hmm.
spend with my family. Then I thought, would I really feel fulfilled? And so,
Mm.
sure, I could work a 9 to 5 job, make some money, and then die. And I just was like, no, that just to me just felt so meaningless. And I just felt like I wanted to take a shot at trying to do something meaningful. And so so I would say the two factors that came into play about trying to do something in India was one, I did visit India. So I was invited to an IGDC conference about 5, 6 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And what I found was I felt like there were people in India who wanted to make great games, but didn't have the opportunity. And,
Mm.
just being in India for the first time, and you see like the great disparity between the haves and the have-nots. I felt like, well, wouldn't it be cool if I could do something positive? And so having a company that is strategically, and let me talk about the strategy a little bit, right? If you're like a veteran group of Western game developers that's super experienced, I'm sure you could be successful.
Mm.
I didn't know that specific team. I just knew that the team that I could put together, I didn't think I could put together a team that had those characteristics that I was talking about that could enable success. And then I thought about India, and maybe I thought, well, maybe we could find some people where they would want more opportunity, and at least we could find people who could try to, give them the opportunity to learn and to improve and grow, and just through sheer hard work could overcome the gap in terms of skill and talent over time.
Yeah.
And for our investors at the time, I basically told them this is going to be a long-term play. No, it
Mm.
turns out it's a lot longer than I thought.
Isn't it
Yeah,
always?
but it was a long-term play, especially since we're trying to do a shooter game. There's a whole backstory behind why we're trying to do a shooter game as well, but at least we'd have a higher chance of success.
I joke a lot that the chance of succeeding in game dev anywhere in the world is low
Yeah.
by default, and you do all you can to tip the scale. What surprised you kind of in India?
Well, I mean, it is a different environment, and I think that I will say, and look, I'm just going to be really direct. So there are a lot of great things about India, and there's some not so great things about India. I
Mm-hmm.
will say that it is dramatically more difficult than I thought to start a game studio for something as technically challenging as a shooter game.
Hmm.
And so while, I have a lot of friends here in Silicon Valley who are Indian and they are brilliant, like, amongst the smartest guys I know, there are, kind of like a lot of them are, maybe even most of them are Indian in terms of the people who I would consider to be the smartest.
Mm-hmm.
But what I didn't realize at the time is that when you go to India, and I'm sure there are incredibly smart people in India. But what I didn't understand is that the game industry itself in India is not viewed favorably. And so the
Mm-hmm.
smartest guys aren't going to be going to a game studio when it comes to like engineering and tech. And so hiring like really high level engineers in terms of having a really solid foundation in terms of like math, logic, that sort of thing has been and continues to be extremely difficult. And so I would probably like, if I were to go back and rethink the strategy, I probably would not have chosen a genre which is as technically challenging as a shooter, because that has really
Mm.
bogged us down quite a lot.
That makes sense. Yeah. What else? So you said there's pros, there's
Yeah, I
cons.
mean, I would say, so look, I would say that the original thesis of finding people who are looking for opportunity who can become great, that has played out. We do have some
Mm-hmm.
people in our studio who are incredible, who could compete anywhere. And so
Mm-hmm.
I'm really happy about that. Maybe one of the other negatives is just like, the rule of law compared to the US is not the same. I mean, we had a guy who stole something like, $25,000 through fraudulent
Oh wow.
means, like forged signatures, stole a bunch of equipment, all this sort of stuff. Um, it's been tied up in the courts for 1.5 years. We provided like overwhelming evidence, including
Mm.
messages and all sorts of stuff. Nothing's really happened. It's the rule of law in India is a little bit. I've been disappointed by that.
Okay.
And I also think that what I found, and hopefully I don't, upset too many people by saying this, is that I do think that there is difference when it comes to like, so part of like one of the main motivators for me to start the company was to provide some kind of opportunity platform, right? So somebody who doesn't have
Yeah.
opportunity, to give them opportunity. But I will say that it's really, really difficult, like for somebody who did not have a solid education, who did not
Mm.
have parents teaching them about, hard work, delayed gratification, investing in themselves and things like that. And to try to overcome that gap in a very small amount of time is extremely difficult and sometimes next to impossible.
Mm.
So, I think that, and this is a argument that I've had with a number of folks in the games industry before about, you know, how easy is it to change people, even more generally. It's very difficult.
Mm.
And I
Yeah.
find that it only typically happens when there is some kind of extreme event or one really strong motivation to change.
Yeah.
And I have found that especially for the kind of people that I would really want to help, those who really do not have that opportunity and they lack the education, they come from a very poor family, things like that. They didn't have those opportunities. Like overcoming 5 to 10 years of education and parenting is super challenging. I really, really like struggled in that and trying to understand how much opportunity do we try to give to folks versus having to think about our business and making the right decisions for the business.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier, and this probably contributes to this, that you said it wasn't looked at favorably working in video games in India, and you didn't expect that. How's that played out?
Well, I mean, I think that so. I mean, the good thing about India as well is that there's a lot of people in India. So the way that plays it out is I do think they're there, and we have found some people there. And so
And when you say they, it's like people who wouldn't be bothered by being in game development or have
like
like
the
support if they go into it,
right,
or
like the kind of people who can learn very quickly or who already have like good skill that are interested in working in game development.
okay.
And I think they're there. It's just very difficult to find. So you have to find that needle in a haystack. And in the US and for most of my friends who are CEOs of game companies, and I know a bunch of them, they don't have like an HR team generally for an early stage startup. We
Hmm.
do because that's really critical for us, trying to find those people. And so, but then even like building an HR team that's capable of um, of executing a recruitment program effectively, that's also been a challenge over the last 4 years as well. So, anyways,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
I mean, but I would say that's part of I'm never going to give up on that. I'm always going to try to find those who don't have opportunity and give them a chance. But I think
Hmm.
the way that I've changed from before is that it's not, we can't, it can't be everybody. And not everybody can be one of these hopeful, what I call a white tiger, because uh, there's a movie actually. My friend produced the movie called The White Tiger, which is about
Okay.
someone in India who came from a poor family, became a driver for a rich family, and then became this entrepreneur. And for me, the main message from this movie, and it was actually originally a book called The White Tiger, is somebody who is able to escape from the chains of their circumstances, right? Like,
Yeah.
this is a much longer story, but like, how does the chicken escape the chicken coop? Uh,
Right.
and so we're always going to try that, but it's not everyone in the company can be. So we're kind of
Yeah.
limiting that.
Got it. And do you think the opinion of game dev has changed in the time you've been there? Do you anticipate it changing anytime in the future?
Even I hope so, because I do think
Okay.
like here in Silicon Valley, if you are, for example, a product manager coming out of gaming, you're kind of viewed favorably, right? As somebody
Hmm.
who's working at the kind of tip of the spear in innovation, that's used to working with many different kinds of disciplines, that's able to navigate both creatives as well as engineers and more technical people. So
Hmm.
there are a lot of skills that you learn as a product manager in gaming that is highly desired by high tech. And so you see a lot of people from gaming go to Netflix or Amazon or Google or wherever. And that kind of an attitude or perception doesn't exist in India yet. I don't think
Mm.
it's really changed too much since I've been here. Maybe it's become a little bit more favorable as more game companies find success, but that really hasn't happened big to a large degree yet.
Got it. Got it. So there's sort you're asking people when they work for you to take like a social capital hit kind of in their own life.
Well, I do
Um,
think like there are some people who are in gaming just because they're so passionate about it, and those
yeah.
are the people that we're trying to find. But
Yeah.
then
Yeah.
also, in some cases, the decision to work at a company may not actually be a single person decision. It might be a family decision, right? And so one of the other things that
Yeah.
we do is we try to prepare materials to help the families understand why gaming is actually a big and growing market, and why
Hmm.
going into game development actually can be favorable if you wanted to go into another industry, for example. And so there's going to be like this process of creating documents and of like education for some of the folks who we recruit. And so we've made that part of our process, and hopefully that has an impact.
That's so interesting. Yeah, I would say that in the Western world, it's rare that you're creating material for somebody's family to help convince them that they should support this decision. Um, so okay, going back, you've been doing this now. You said like 4 years active, and then 5 years really when you think about when you got the genesis of the idea. You've taken your fair share of bumps and bruises, I don't doubt, as every entrepreneur and startup CEO does. If you were to go back, what would you do differently about how you approach things?
if I were to go back, I might actually just take a job.
Okay.
Uh,
All that stuff about meaning and fulfillment, you're like, no, just take a job.
I mean, I'm in it now, and I'm okay. I'm glad where I am today, and I do think
Yeah.
like and we've talked about this before in terms of the importance of pain and suffering. And
Yeah.
we talked about Viktor Frankl's book Man's Search for Meaning and things like that, and kind of like some of the philosophies of Nietzsche and so forth. And so I actually do think that part of the human experience is it is important to have suffering in your life. And I think that even recently, I shared this video of Jensen Huang, who talks about pain and suffering and how he felt it's important for his employees at NVIDIA. So from that perspective, I'm glad I've kind of gone through this experience, but I'm not going to lie. Has been probably the hardest, one of the hardest experiences of my life. It's been extremely costly in terms of not only the financial hit, but the hit I've taken to my health, spending half my time
Mm,
in India, being away from my family. I mean,
mm.
there was a time there was last year I probably almost got divorced 3 times. I mean, it's been rough.
I appreciate the honesty around it because I think, well, I'll say this: it's easy to take a very optimistic view when you get into something, any sort of I think entrepreneurial endeavor, and it's easy to look at the successful entrepreneurs who often make quite a bit of money and believe something about that being easy, or I don't know that they didn't work harder, they didn't earn it, and in the vast majority of cases, they have stories like the one you just said, which is like this is really hard, and maybe I came out the other side, but there is a survivorship bias. For every one that you see that was a phenomenal success, there are 99 that didn't do so well and 90 that totally failed and just lost a bunch of money and maybe ended up in a lot of debt or whatever it was, and with impact their relationships. And that just like reinforcing this is really hard stuff.
Yeah.
Um,
And I mean, I do think that there are folks who have been extremely successful without having to go through that suffering.
yes,
But I
yeah,
would say that for me, the way that I think about it is because I do think too many people basically equate success to a financial outcome. And that's where I think that, I don't know, I think that's the wrong way to think about it. I would think about it more in terms of, how much has, has your experiences added to your character and, to your
hmm
life experience? Because, to some degree, just thought experiment. What if you could just be happy and have everything you wanted for your entire life and then you die? I would not want that. That's not a full
mm,
life, right? And um, I think the best kind of life is filled with the different kinds of human experience that exist. Now, there can be too much, right? Then there can be too much suffering. And there are certainly people who live lives that I think are, um, extremely sad in the sense that it can be, they can have really, really dramatically bad experiences, which I feel really bad about. And I think there is that. But I mean, to some degree, I would say over the last 10 years, at least in Silicon Valley, we've gone too much to the other side where it's all about, you know, what can I get? What's in it for me? How can I just be happy? How can I do the least work possible? What can I get?
mm,
And this also like complete focus on feelings. I always have to feel happy. I,
mm.
for me, I reject that. I've already thought it through for myself. That's not a life that for me would be meaningful.
Yeah. It, when you said earlier, I said like, what would you do differently? You said maybe I'd just take a job. That does that fit into that lens of hey, that would be me kind of taking the let's just go and have the money and be happy and whatever, or is there more
Maybe, yeah.
there?
I think there's to some degree, and the first podcast that we recorded, I talked about duality, right?
Yeah.
And so that's
Yep.
kind of that's kind of the duality in my own mind of like, man, wouldn't it have just been easier just to do the other thing? And so while I long for that, and let's say a space alien came to me, transported me back in time, and said, "What do you want to do? Do you want to actually do this thing in India, or do you want to just take a job, an easy job, make a lot of money, and not have all this pain and suffering in front of you?" And let's say I've picked the easy path, then I'm sure on that easy path, I'd be like, "Man, this life is so meaningless." And while I'm happy,
Yeah.
my life doesn't have any meaning. So I think I think all of us think about different choices that we make, and that's kind of the beauty of a choice, is that there are trade-offs either way that you go.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So let's say that space alien came, pulled you back, and you didn't go, oh, let me just take a job. You said, no, I'm going to take the hard path. Um, the roughly the one you took. I'm going to start my own thing. I'm going to see if I can make that work in games. Under that context, what would you do differently?
I think I would have. So we made a lot of mistakes. One thing I mentioned is that I do think a shooter for India, where you really do require extreme technical expertise, may not have been the right choice. And so maybe I would have picked another genre, or I would have picked a different country. I probably would have tried to um, reassess what would give me the best opportunity for success. Now, whether that's not India in a different country, or India in a different genre or different product approach, something like that. Um, and I do think we made a lot of mistakes in terms of like some of the lessons we learned. We did not have right alignment, both from a cultural perspective and from a product perspective. We were building. That was a
Mm,
mistake. And so, with the benefit of hindsight, I probably would have just undone some of the mistakes that we made.
yeah. And when you say product and cultural alignment, like how to go one level deeper, what would that have looked like to get in? Because there's people out there that are listening to this who are they're starting companies, and wherever they are in the world, I think product and cultural alignment matter a lot, regardless of your genre, regardless of your place or your geography. What's something concrete that they might have done differently, that you would have done differently, that would have been like, hey, this would have set us up for better
Yeah,
success?
well, I mean, I think that well, you know, we did not have a good idea of the game that we were building. And
Mm-hmm.
so it was very high level. And this is kind of like the hand wavy problem of like being in the clouds rather than being like on the ground operational with very specific concrete details. But from a
Mm-hmm.
product perspective, it was very, very unclear for way too long. And so
Mm-hmm.
that's on the product side. And I think that we probably should have, and I think all of our investors, and by the way, there was a conversation before about, I think on LinkedIn where you talked about the kind of investors that would potentially be beneficial versus not beneficial. Our investors have been very understanding, but I should have
Mm-hmm.
pushed that more. I should have kept our team smaller until more stuff was figured out.
Mm-hmm.
So that was, a typical mistake, happens a lot. I think that
Yeah. Yeah.
almost every team I've ever been on talks about the importance of pre-production. And it's always been, there wasn't a single time where the pre-production was done properly. So
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure where that keeps happening over and over again. But that's, I don't know. So I
Yeah.
keep repeating the definition of insanity for some reason. Uh,
Well, two things to say there. One, I think the definition of insanity being uh, doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. If that is actually the definition of insanity, I think pretty much most people are insane, because that's what I think most people do in so many areas of their
yeah.
life, relationships, work, all kinds of things. Um, I think the second one, and I'll kick this theory your way. Maybe we can just talk about it a little bit. One of the reasons I think that happens is no matter where you are in game development, even at a very well funded studio where you've been told, hey, you've got a ton of runway, or you've got a very, like you said, you have very understanding investors who are like, yeah, that's okay. You take the time you need, right? There's still some amount of pressure that you experience. And my theory around why we always rush pre-production is because pre-production is to acknowledge when we're in pre-production, we are saying out loud, we don't quite know what this is yet. And that's an uncomfortable thing to say. That's an uncomfortable thing for a leader to acknowledge when someone says, well, what's your game? It's like, I don't know exactly. It's something like this, maybe. Unless we have to pivot again. Unless, the next concept doesn't work out. Unless the next playtest gives us horrible results. And then it's going to be something totally different. And I don't even know what that thing is. And there's this uncertainty. And so when it comes to the product development space, you have this massive uncertainty. But on the practical side, namely, there's a number of dollars in the bank, and at some point they go away. That's really concrete. And I can watch that number go down. And you'd say, like, well, wouldn't that make you keep your team small? And it's like, I think that makes sense as a thing where you might think that that's what would happen. But I think what actually happens is we go, well, let's just move forward and almost pretend we did a good job in pre-production and act as though as if we have the answers, because at least then we don't have to deal with the uncertainty of all of this. And then we'll scale up the team and we'll start building all the stuff. And then if we get more stuff, that'll reinforce our certainty around what it is we're doing. And the opposite happens. Instead, you grow your team. You still have lots of uncertainty, except now the uncertainty is held in more people. Aligning them becomes more difficult. You're burning money and you still don't know what your game is. But I think there's something in there around that desire for certainty. Curious what your thoughts are.
Desire for certainty, or I would say maybe more in our case was the desire to see progress or the feeling of progress.
Yeah. Yep.
And sometimes you're stuck and, you have to solve certain problems to get unstuck. I don't know. I mean, to some degree though, if we didn't make more hires and push, we couldn't have found some of the problems that we found. So I don't know, you can kind of argue that maybe we just had to go through that process of hiring people and then letting them go to get the right person in eventually. But yeah, I would say that just going back to the problem was we spent way too much time really characterizing specifically the product and the product vision. And I think that the other thing too is because we picked such an ambitious project, literally everything was not working. Every team was not working. And when you're in that kind of a situation, and the way that I work is something that I call just biggest fires, that I try to find the biggest fire and work on that and work down. So then there's all these problems that just aren't getting addressed. And some of those problems could be critical to the success of the company. So like if there's too much stuff that's broken, it's really, I mean, that's what causes the massive pain and suffering. And so I would say like, there are some teams that are experienced and that work together where maybe 20% is broken. But coming in where like literally everything is broken you're setting yourself up for a world of pain and delays and necessarily going to require time and iteration. And that's kind of what was our situation. So, I mean, I can name 100 other problems, but that was one of them. And there were many, many more, including fixing every team and finding leads for every team. And, going through many, I mean, we went through like, I don't know, 5 art directors and went through, I think we're on our 7th HR lead. So it's, it's a little crazy.
Yeah. What's a role you would have hired earlier with what you know now, and what's a role you would have hired later with what you know now?
I would have hired so this is the problem. Okay. So so for me, one of the philosophies I have is that, and this is something I got from Principles by Ray Dalio, the book Principles, is that if you break down a company, it's basically 2 things, people and culture. And so what I probably would have done is I would have focused on hiring as good of an HR lead as possible, spending whatever it takes. And I think even today, like what we'll see, our most recent HR lead, she seems to be extremely good, like
Nice.
literally at least 10 times better than anyone we've ever had before. At least 10 times. That's minimum. Uh, and I just think, well, damn, what if we started with her? I mean, that
Yeah.
would have
Yeah.
saved us so much headache and misery and pain. But at the same time, it was very difficult for us because just like the model is so different. And so, for example, I would say that when you think about HR, and I'll just go into the weeds a little bit about why this is difficult.
Yeah.
So, like in India, a lot of the HR teams, I'm not saying it's every company, but a lot of it is viewed as it's structured in a very verticalized way. And so you have like, you might have a big team of a bunch of people. Instead of having like one HR, especially for a small company, you might have like 5 or 6. Why? Because it's so cheap. Yeah, just hire all these cheap people that don't make very much. And you have one person for comp, one person for policy, one person for recruiting, talent acquisition, one for, and then you just split up all these functions. And then the senior or lead HR just goes, what'd you do? What'd you do? What'd you do? What'd you do? And does nothing themselves, which
Okay.
is quite different from what I was looking for, which is somebody who was able to think from first principles, and also had a team or a person who's very compact and cross-functional. More of a kind of 90s Silicon Valley kind of HR person, and somebody who can help us really look after learning and development, training, helping us build our management leadership layer. And so what I found was that anyone who had more than 5 years of experience, and I've interviewed now probably over 1,000 people in HR, that
Wow.
over 4+ years, is that a lot of these people after like 3-4 years want to become a manager and be that what'd you do, what'd you do, what'd you do, what'd you do kind of person, and not want to do any work. So, and it was just because of the way it's structured and the kind of people that are going into HR, and HR not being viewed as strategic, generally speaking. I'm sure there are exceptions. Please don't, I
Yeah. Yeah.
got,
No, fair enough.
just for the audience, please no hate messages anymore. I'm like, okay. But anyway,
Your anecdotal experience points to,
yes,
yes.
points to like, that's been the general person. But again, there's so many people in India that there is going to be that superstar. There is going to be, but again, finding that diamond in the rough is difficult. But if I had that person to help me find the diamonds in the rough earlier, because ultimately the company are the people. The people make all the difference.
Yeah.
To me, that was maybe one of the biggest mistakes I made. And if I were to find someone like that, but just say, you know what, we're going to pay whatever it takes, it probably would have been worth it.
The idea that you hired too quickly or hired without as strong an idea of what you needed as you thought, that's so resonant with me. I've seen that in big companies. I've seen that in small companies, where you hire some number of candidates, and I appreciate that you said like I've probably hired or interviewed 1,000 people, because I think it's like, well, for this really important leadership role, which is what an HR lead is, we looked at 6 different people. This is the best
Yeah.
one, and it's like, yeah, but
Yeah.
maybe
Maybe not over 1,000. Actually, let me. I don't want to be dishonest here, but
let's
certainly
say
hundreds.
hundreds,
Absolutely hundreds.
hundreds, yeah, hundreds.
Maybe
And
approaching
so
1,000.
so hundreds, maybe approaching 1,000. But when you have such a high impact thing, and you are a startup, and this person is going to be who establishes so much culture, I think that idea of going like, well, shoot, maybe I can't pay the most money compared to a giant established company. So I am looking for that diamond in the rough. I am looking for the person who's willing to come and try this out and accept some amount of equity as a reward, and see if we can make this thing successful. And simultaneously, has the right values and the right approach. This is a non-trivial problem, but every time I've seen someone make the other decision where they rush the hire and they go, wow, this person isn't quite what we're looking for, but they're the best we've seen, so we'll bring them in.
Yeah.
I've never seen that work out. I've never seen that go well. It always it always ends up causing more problems than it solves in the long run. And usually there's somebody on the hiring panel, if you have a hiring panel in like a larger organization, that kind of can point to like, well, we said this in the when we were interviewing them, we said like, and I'm sure that's not an 100% thing. That again is also my anecdotal experience that points to something, but it is, man, key leadership roles. You I'm not saying you can't find it on the first one if they really knock it out of the park and they're just right and hit all the things you're looking for, but knowing what you're looking for and then waiting till you find it is worthwhile, even though there's an urgent need that you have.
Right. And on
Um,
the opposite side of that, I think the other problem too is like, and I mentioned that alignment was an issue as well, but I would also say in particular, probably should have spent more time with co-founders on this very specific, kind of cultural and philosophical alignment. Because, for example, so let's say you hired some people who are, or a case where somebody is good in terms of performance, in terms of their work, but bad in terms of culture and ruining culture
mhm.
for the company. So
Yeah,
then again, my philosophy is easy: fire, done. But they go,
right. Yeah.
what's going to happen in this? And then, it's like, if we get rid of this person, it's going to make my team look bad and this and that. And so, but you got to have that alignment in around the philosophies and things like that. And I think that was an issue. Um, and
What's what's a specific thing that you wish you and your co-founders had gotten on the same page about earlier?
I think we should have been more clear on expectations and deadlines and consequences and accountability of what happens when that doesn't, when those things don't occur. And then on some of the things in terms of like, when do we hire, when do we fire, those kinds of things, it was more ad hoc. And then, how
Mm.
do we deal with compensation for specific employees rather than like, now we try to make it more consistent rather than,
Hmm.
you know, well, why is our team getting all these outrageous salaries under this guy, but then, in this other team, your product team, everyone's being paid, less than market. What's going on? So you got these
Right.
inconsistencies and things like that. So, yeah.
Yeah. It's it's so interesting because I think so many people get into games and even do startups. They're like, man, I really want to make a game, and so much of what you've talked about is, as you said, Ray Dalio said, it's people and culture. It's how do I it's overused, I think, like get the right people on the bus, and it can have some toxic effects if you run too far in that direction. But this idea of no, what really I need to be thinking about as a CEO is the people, how I'm taking care of them, how I'm setting them up, and is the organization broadly on the same page about how we're going to interact with them, treat them, expect things from them, hold them accountable, create consequence, positive or negative. Like there's yeah, it's I'd say that if you're out there and you're thinking about becoming a CEO, thinking that you're just going to spend all day, trying out cool new ideas and games and stuff, it's like no, you're going to spend a lot of time in this
Yeah,
space.
and getting the right people on the bus isn't just about talent, right? It's to the point that we were talking about in terms of alignment. And I don't know how real this
Yeah.
statistic is, but somebody had mentioned to me before that 70% of Y Combinator companies, the reason they fail is co-founder conflicts. And so if that's the
Mm.
case, then those conflict can be mitigated by having a proper co-founder pre-production, like
Yeah. Yeah.
aligning ahead of time and making sure everybody's clear in terms of philosophy, culture, approach, policies, things like that.
Yeah. Okay. What advice broadly, based on your experience, you've been doing this a while. There's a lot of leaders in game dev out there. What advice do you have for them in the generic sense?
I think that, so my broad advice would just be situational context. And I think that's the thing where, and this is my disappointment. Well, two things: situational context and depth. And those two things go together, right? Because I just feel there's too many executives who manage by hand wavy keywords, right? And they'll read some they'll hear some soundbite, or they'll see some, fortune cookie wisdom on X, Twitter, and then, it's just like, oh my God. Or they'll just see what they've done before and try the same thing, but without depth in that first principles thinking and then understanding your specific situation, you can sometimes apply the wrong thing. And that's
Mm.
what we see so often, or I've seen so often when I look at other folks, is just that lack of depth and understanding their situation and making the right decisions. Oh yeah, that's one other thing. I think there is way too little focus on decision analysis, just broadly in the games industry. Right. And so even within our company, there have been so many decisions that have been made by basically people just pulling random opinions out of their asses. And so they didn't fully consider everything. And so like these quick, you know, um, these really quick decisions are made on things that are very, very important. It's like, like what's that book? Thinking Fast and Slow, and the type one
Yeah.
thinking versus type two thinking. And too many decisions are made based upon the type one thinking for very complex and difficult decisions that may be like, in a Jeff Bezos style one way door decisions, or the very costly decisions. And so like characterizing, writing down, and whether you do that through like a logic tree of some kind, but there needs just to be more rigor and more critical thinking around important decisions. And then those things need to be documented in a way and shared so that everybody's on the same page, because it's like, oh, should we, random thing. Should we have one rig for male and female, or should we have two different rigs for male and female? Well, how do you make that decision? And like, an artist might be thinking about the look, our animator may be thinking about something else, engineering may be thinking about performance and other things, but like, let's put it all down with all of the considerations in one place and then carefully consider, rather than I see this part, and then it just becomes a religious argument, for example, right? And then at some
Yeah.
point, some dumb exec just makes a call, and it's just, it's just, then you're really you're really just rolling the dice on a lot of these decisions, rather than actually having a very like thoughtful, first principle based, considered decision. And I just see that time and time and time again.
Yeah. It brings to mind for me this idea of how so when we are in chaotic environments, we experience a lot of stress and anxiety and cortisol, and that's intentional because when we're in chaotic environments with it, almost the definition of that is there's a lot of things happening around me that I don't understand. I don't know what to do, and so I'm in chaos, and I certain parts of my brain deprioritize, namely type 2 thinking, that like sort of slow thinking goes down, fast thinking goes up, and we start responding. Um, I was trained as a leader for combat, and that is a chaotic environment. And sometimes you have to make a fast call because a slow you don't have
Right.
time. You don't have
Yeah.
time to make a slow call. What was interesting is as I left that environment and went into game dev, I found that often because of the potential stress in an environment, people thought they were in chaos and they responded like they were in chaos. They responded with fast decisions, like, "Oh, I need to know now." Let's. When in fact, I love this principle of sort of lean manufacturing, just-in-time decision making, where you kind of go, "Wait a minute, when do we need to have this decision made?" And if the answer is yesterday, then okay, let's make it and go. But sometimes the answer is like, actually, if we don't make this decision until next week, or a month from now, or 6 months from now, we'll actually be okay. Whatever that delta is between then and now, assuming that's an important, as you said, assuming we think of that as a very important decision, we have time now to go, okay, then I don't need to rush this. I don't need to rush that decision so that a decision has been made. Now we all know what to do. It's actually like, no, take the time you need. But I wonder if when we experience the stress and anxiety, our brains kind of just trick us into going like, you're in chaos, move quickly, when it could be like, slow down. Like you said, let's put the different perspectives on the table. What are we trying to achieve? The rig question. Do we have one rig, two rigs? anybody who's done game development for any length of time can immediately start going like, oh, pros and cons, right? Like I can start laying this out. What's what's it for? What's like you said, what's the situational context? Let's all contribute something, and then recognize that someone's going to make a call, but they can make a call that's not just, oh, one rig for both, because I don't know, that's what I feel like right now. Because that's what I did in my last company. Because that feels intuitively correct. But actually, wait a minute. What are we trying to achieve with this? What is even the intention of the rig? Did we do any of that thinking?
Right. Yeah. I think maybe some other bits of advice or recommendations is actually 2 points I think that sound really obvious and easy, but are never done especially in large companies. One is something which I just call the hard thing, right? So essentially, like, whatever your discipline, there's usually a hard thing and easier things. And oftentimes what I've seen time and time again is just like people try to do the easy things first and then get to the hard thing later. But usually you want to prioritize the hard thing first. And I think we might have talked about this before, but like usually I believe that often happens because of fear. Like you're afraid you're not going to be able to solve the problem. You want to show people you're making progress. You don't want to have other people realize that you this hard thing is just too hard for you, or you bang your head against the hard thing and it's just like you don't feel good about it. So you want to just do something else that's easier so you can show something, right? So there's that. So that's the hard thing. And then the other thing is like, and we talked about stakes before, but I do think the ability to have the difficult conversation, and this is the bigger thing. This is the thing that it is so hard. I would say less than 10% of people, maybe dramatically less than 10% of people can actually read that issue that you have, the problem, because you have to call somebody out and talk to them about a really big problem or issue. 90% plus of the time, most teams in the world, that conversation does not. And, I wish it would, because then, you would rather not feel uncomfortable, or you would rather not have that discussion. And in some cases, it's because you can't, as we mentioned before, because there might be some political issues based upon the culture and the kind of company you're in. But even when you're in the right culture where you can have that conversation, I don't know, some people just can't do it. And, you just can't have that conversation. So.
And is your advice to have that conversation?
You have to do whatever you can to have that conversation. And I don't know, I mean, or you need to put a person in place that can have that conversation. And don't put it on the person who doesn't have the personality, who cannot do it. Then put it into the hands of someone who can.
A guy wrote something, I think it was called The Diary of an Unreal Engineer, and he'd been doing video game development in Unreal for a very, very, very long time, and he would go consult with companies. And he said after he would go into the company, he'd talk to a bunch of people, then he'd go report to the CTO or whoever hired him. And they'd always be like, what? How did you get the team to tell you all these insights about our company? We didn't know any of this. And he was like, it's like they thought I was, either torturing them or bribing them or some fancy. It was like, I just asked them.
Yeah.
But no one had ever asked him. And I think that most companies out there know the problems internal. Someone internal knows the problem. And probably some people know about some problems that aren't real problems, but the vast majority, if not all of the problems that your company has, are known by the people that work there.
Yeah. Yeah.
The question is, are you having the conversation and learning from
right.
them
And
what they know?
I would submit to you that whoever is listening to this podcast right now, the majority of people, if you're working in a game studio, you know of something. You're just not going to bring it up. You know who you are. I'm talking to you in the audience listening right now. There is a greater than 50% chance, maybe much higher than 50%, that there is something, there's an issue, there's a problem, and you have not raised it. You have not addressed it. And you may not, just because you can't, or the conditions that your company would have a cost for you to raise it.
Yeah. Yeah. I've never worked in any job where that wasn't true.
Yeah.
In game dev or out. There was always, and then the question is, what happens when you raise it? And this is where, if you are out there and you're trying to build a team or a company, one of the questions I think you should have is, how do I make it safe for people to raise it? How do I make it safe?
I would say, I would suspect 80% of the people who aren't raising the issue, it's not a company problem, it's a you problem. You just don't have the balls to raise it. In 80% of it, let's just be real, right?
Yeah. Well, it's something they probably haven't observed. They haven't been trained to
Yeah.
do. If anything, they've seen the opposite pattern. They've seen, you said that you saw issues and you were told, leave it alone.
Yeah.
Leave that alone. We don't talk about that. We don't. That's wasting who knows how much money every month. Don't worry about it.
Yeah.
But
And I hate to give the advice like, here, you have to raise these problems and bring them to management, and somebody does and they get fired. And that could happen.
Well, one of the things I'll say though is, one, I would guess most people see more than one of those issues, and a thing that I've encouraged people to do is, okay, the right way to handle this issue, especially if you're not that familiar with raising the issues, with having the hard conversation, is probably not like, sending an email to the CEO and CCing the entire company with, this is what the issue is.
Yeah.
Like, that's not going to go well. But what you could do is you could say, okay, I see 5 issues maybe, and let me stack rank them in 2 ways. One is, how bad are they for the company, and the other is, how much risk am I engaging by even talking about this? Pick one that's reasonably high on, or like high on the first scale if you can find it, and lower on the second scale, and then find a leader who you think you could trust.
Yeah.
Maybe it's your boss, maybe it's a peer, maybe, or somebody else, right? And bring that one issue up, and just be like, I'd like to bring this one issue up, because in some sense you almost need reps doing this.
You do.
To get
you can
familiar
get better
with it.
So that's the thing with personality and like reading these issues, is with more reps and starting small and working your way up, you can become that person. And I actually, so when I worked at FunPlus, one of the co-founders of FunPlus, Vital, one of the biggest lessons I learned from him, just kind of related to this issue, is that the other thing that happens is that these people that know the big problems at a company, instead of raising the issue, they spend most of their time just shit talking and gossiping. And they'll be like, oh yeah, Fred or Sally, blah, blah, he's so fucked up. He does this and does that, blah, blah, blah. We got these problems. And all they do is gossip and basically orient and just obsess on the problem. And the one there's a couple of lessons I learned, but one of the big lessons I learned from Yital was like, he would say to me, you spend too much time talking about the problem. If you spent more time doing something about the problem, you would be more successful. And I was like, yeah, you're right. So so after that, I kind of came up with this framework that I call winners, warners, and whiners, right? And so a winner is somebody who I basically call a determined optimist, meaning you're optimistic about your ability to solve a problem, but you're realistic about your situation and you do something about it, which allows your company or studio to win. A warner is somebody who may not be able to do that just because of their personality, whatever, but they can at least raise the issue. Hey, here's this problem. Talk to the right person. They themselves may not be able to do the right things or to, confront the person or this or that, but they can at least warn.
Yeah.
And then finally, the whiners are the ones who all they do is talk shit and gossip. And my point being, like, if you can convert your company to spending like 20% or 10% whining, and the vast majority of the time being solutions oriented, my God, how much more efficient, productive would your game studio be? And so you want to try to figure out how to invert this, the amount of time you spend on talking and like commiserating on a problem, and make that time be mainly about focusing on the solution and trying different kinds of solutions. And I do think that if you can do that, your probability of success and those outcomes are going to dramatically increase.
Yeah. Yeah, I think especially if you get that across a company. Yeah, because it's weird when if you were to go ask CEOs in the wild, hey, would you rather your people brought up issues or didn't? Most of them would say, oh, I'd rather they bring them up. And then when you go and you say, cool, do you behave in a way that encourages that? And are you hiring for that? And are you rewarding it when people do it? Um, it's like, oh, okay, maybe that's not
Correct.
happening as much. Um, that root cause of I think most people do want to know. Like I could say for you, if I asked you as a CEO, like, do you want to know? Do you wish people brought you more problems that you could help them resolve? It's probably like yes, because I'm one set of eyeballs. I had one more
Okay.
question, and then there's perhaps an open ended space, but maybe we already covered this. But it's what do you think most of game dev is getting wrong right now?
There was research done many years ago called the Games Outcomes Project.
Mm-hmm.
And they studied a lot of different games and the factors that led to success or failure. And the two risks that they highlighted that were the biggest that had the highest kind of correlation with successful outcomes was one, risk. Did this company address their biggest risks first? And two, the
Mm.
scope of the project. Was the game appropriately scoped or did they try something too ambitious? I think we may have made a mistake on the second part because the scope of the project for the kind of team that we have, it's a lot. So there's a lot to overcome.
Mm-hmm.
But those would be the things that I think that people should watch out for, and that's kind of like impacting the outcomes of games today.
Cool. Anything else you want to add? Anything else you want to cover today?
I think it's important, especially if you are some kind of, you don't have to be a founder, but even if you're a lead or a founder at a game studio, you are in a role that can potentially move the needle for your product and can help determine the successful outcome for your game. I think it's very important to have an open mind and to also always kind of like reevaluate how you're doing things. And to that end, I think it's important to have some kind of external feedback. So a tribe of some kind. And
Mm-hmm.
I personally also meet once a month with a group of 6 other game studio CEOs. And we regularly talk about different problems and issues that we all face. And I think that there is bias. There are folks who aren't thinking clearly about the way that they're doing things, and having that external group to basically keep you in check. Are you going to admit a mistake if somebody on your team proves you're wrong on something, or are you going to let your ego get in the way and dismiss it or hide it? Like keep an
Mm.
open mind and regularly audit yourself. That would be my last bit of advice.
Love it. Love it. Anything you want to plug before
Sure.
we end this one up?
Well, I do have a similar to you. I've got a game development newsletter. So if you go to gamemakers.com, you can kind of check it out. I'm actually trying to improve the newsletter and make it better and more useful. But if you can check it out, and feel free to send me some feedback on what you'd like to see or how to make it better. I think that would be great.
Awesome. Awesome. And you're still doing the podcast as well?
Yep. Kind of irregularly, but I do want to do it more regularly this year.
Okay. All right. I don't want to miss that because there's some good stuff on there too for folks out there in the audience. Well, thanks a ton. I appreciate you spending the time again. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, and I always feel like I get like real stuff, real stories from someone who's really doing it. So I appreciate that. Thank
All
you.
right.
Okay, here's my takeaways from this episode. First, consider that Western game dev may be more complacent than it needs to be to succeed in the global market of game dev. especially when you consider how expensive game dev is in North America and even parts of Europe. Second, the presence or absence of real stakes for an individual impacts how likely they are to address the real issues they see in your studio. If you're in a low stakes environment, it's much easier for problems to remain and fester over time. Third, experience as a team is more important than experience as an individual. It takes time for a team to learn how to work together. Do you have that time? Fourth, meaning and fulfillment are worth considering as you look over the whole of your life. A life with everything you wanted, where you are reasonably happy, may be what you think you want, but in the end, it may not provide the fulfillment and meaning that was available to you. Fifth, cultural views of employment, HR, the games industry, how people make decisions, and many other things may play a bigger role in the people that work with you than you might think. Cultures aren't all similar. There are big differences to take seriously if you're a global company or starting a company overseas. Sixth, starting something, anything new is difficult. As scope and scale and desired impact increase, so too do the difficulties. It is also something that might grow you more than anything else you will ever do in your life. Seventh, everyone talks about the importance of pre-production, but then we tend to always get it wrong. Whether out of fear or anxiety or a desire for progress, something to ponder as you develop a game. Why is that happening? Can you do better? Eighth, companies are made up of culture and people, and they are interrelated. It is so unlikely that you will overinvest in aligning around these things as a group of leaders or founders that you may as well run the risk. Most companies don't spend enough time thinking about people and culture, and they pay the price for that. Ninth, do the hard thing first. It may be scary, but if you wait till later, it will probably only get harder and higher risk. This includes your work, but also includes things like having difficult conversations that you know need to be had. 10th, be wary of gossip and fruitless complaining from yourself or from others. It will not help you, even if it feels cathartic. That's all I've got. Thanks.